These 3 Sundays together, we have been looking at a 3-week fitness boot camp, if you will, looking at a fitness regime. The first Sunday morning, we looked at the question of diet, and we had 5 takeaways and didn't put on any weight, so that was good. And then last week, we looked at the need for exercise, and we looked at daily exercises found in the Word of God that help us stay spiritually fit. My subject this morning is one that I'm a bit of an expert on, but it's seldom mentioned from the pulpit. You're more likely to read about it in a doctor's surgery waiting room or maybe a woman's magazine, but it certainly occupies the thoughts of the vast majority of the population. And that's the problem of obesity. The problem of being overweight. Now, I thought I seen you all breathe in a wee bit there as soon as I mentioned obesity. So don't try and hold your breath in for the rest of the meeting, because you could do yourself a damage. We live in a generation that are paranoid with looks and size and the way people see themselves or the way they feel that others perceive them. And as a result, if you went on to Google Diets, you'll find about 22 million websites dedicated to different kinds of diets that all promise to work. You have the Atkins diet, you have the Slimming World diet, you have the Scarsdale diet, and you have detox diets and cabbage soup diets, and there's millions of them all out there. Of course, this morning I want you to relax, because my burden is not on the physical, being physically overweight. I'll leave that issue to the dietitians and the politicians and the doctors. My concern this morning is even more serious than physical obesity. My concern this morning is spiritual obesity. It is possible to be spiritually overweight, and the Bible has a lot to say about the flesh. And when the Bible talks about the flesh, it's talking about our sinful nature, our proneness to sin, even as children of God. And that sin and those sinful instincts that we have. You see, before we trust Christ as Savior, we enjoy feeding the flesh and feeding that sinful nature. But whenever we become a Christian, an internal battle commences. We don't want to feed our sinful nature, but Satan makes sure that it plagues us, tempts us, frustrates us, and sometimes beats us. Paul knew all about it. He described it in Romans chapter 7. He says, the good that I want to do, I feel to do, and the things that I hate to do that would damage me, that's what I find myself doing. The battle of the flesh. In verse 18 of Romans 7, Paul goes on to say, for I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. And every believer, without exception, has a daily battle to feed the spiritual nature and starve the sinful nature. Now, some Christians give the impression that they don't have any such battle. They're very spiritual. They usually carry a very big Bible. They're very knowledgeable. And they give the impression that they live up on a spiritual cloud somewhere. But the reality is that they battle like the rest of us. It is common to all believers that we fight against the enemy on a daily, if not hourly, basis. And if the great apostle Paul struggled with such a battle, so no doubt will we. This morning, what I want to do is to highlight just 4 problems that occur whenever we feed the flesh. And the first one is found here in Deuteronomy 32, and we're looking at verse 15. This chapter gives Moses' swan song. In verse 49 of this chapter, he will receive the command to go up into Mount Nebo, and he'll die there, and God will bury him. This is a song that he sings as he comes to the end of his life. And in it he says this, but Jeshurun, which is a poetic form of Israel, but Israel waxed fat and kicked. Thou art waxen fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. Moses in this song, under inspiration, highlights the fact that when you feed the flesh, it can lead to an empty profession of the Lord. That's what he says here. Israel, you wax fat and you kicked, you're waxing fat, you're growing thick, you're not covered with fullness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed or rejected the rock of his salvation. Israel was so blessed of God, so favored. When they sat round the table at night, they could recount the stories of Abraham called out of Ur of the Chaldees, heading to a land that he knew not, the patriarch of the nation. They could remember the stories of how they were in bondage in Egypt, and there in Exodus 12, they got the wee lamb and they killed it, and they put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel, and they recited the promise of God, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. They could tell the stories of the battle of Rephidim, and how Moses stood on the mountaintop, and when his hands were aloft, Israel was winning, and when his hands got heavy, the Amalekites were winning, and how Israel won the day. They could tell the story of the victory of Jericho as they marched round in Joshua chapter 6, and they marched round and the walls came tumbling down. What a history. But as a nation, they fed the flesh. They became spiritually fat, and the things of God became an empty profession, and they abandoned things that they once held dear. Dear saint of God, this morning, across our province of Ulster, we have thousands of churches, mission halls, outreaches, assemblies. They thrive on ministry. We soak in spiritual truth like a sponge. We are biblically literate, theologically proficient, but many of us subtly or imperceptibly have fed the flesh, and we have a generation of believers with biblical knowledge, but their soul is empty and barren. And they can win an argument, but there's no thrill anymore. There's no excitement anymore. It's a dry and empty profession. Whenever my children were young, they're all up and married now, and I have 8 grandchildren. Whenever they were small, if we got a chance, we used to pack up the car and head to the beach. And our beach of choice was downhill. You could drive the car onto the beach, and my first task whenever you arrived at the beach was to get out the wee swimming pool, just a wee round swimming pool, and I had to blow it up. By the time I blew it up, I was ready for lying down in the car again or going home. But I blew up the wee swimming pool, went down to the sea and brought up buckets of water, and my children splashed in that wee paddling pool, quite content. But one day my oldest, Jeffrey, he looked up and he saw the ocean. He saw the waves. And all of a sudden this wee paddling pool was boring. Daddy, I don't want to. I want down there. I want to be down with the waves. I want to be down. That's exciting. This is boring. We went down to the waves. I'm convinced that many, many of God's people are still in the paddling pool. when they should be down at the ocean, facing the waves and the excitement, and it's become boring to them. You heard about the wee boy who fell out of bed one night. He let up a yell and his mummy came running in, got him up, get him into bed again. He says, Jimmy, why did you fall out of bed? He says, Mummy, I think I stayed too close to where I got in. And many of God's people are falling out of love with church, falling out of love with God, falling out of love with His Word. Why? They've stayed too close to where they get in. They never faced the waves and never knew the excitement of what God can do in a life surrendered to Him. And it's become a spiritual routine, a treadmill of religious observance, and the thrill is gone. Speaking to a man not that long ago, doesn't go to any church now, once was keen for the Lord. I said to him, I was trying to encourage him to come back, and he said to me, Laurence, where's the excitement that the preacher talked about the night I got saved? Where's the thrill? Where's the excitement? I said, brother, the excitement's still there. And Christ hasn't diminished at all. And the work of God is still thrilling. It's you that's got cold. It's you that's walked away. And I told him the wee story about the paddling pool and the waves. I said, you've stayed in the paddling pool. The thrill is gone. They look back cynically at those days of passion. They know enough theology to win an argument. But in our souls, we lightly esteem the rock of our salvation. Dear saint of God in Coleraine, maybe you're struggling today on a physical diet like myself. You long for chocolate or crisps or something that maybe wouldn't be good on the waistline. I call on you this morning to watch your spiritual diet. It's not about head knowledge alone. It's not about keeping traditions alone. It's not about keeping up numbers alone. It's about our love and our passion for Jesus Christ. Don't feed on anything that will hinder your love for the Savior. I was thinking on the way down the car, whenever Paul was writing to the church at Galatia in chapter 6, he says, be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. But it doesn't end there, sure it doesn't. We often stop the quotation there. It goes on to say, for he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, and he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. So the first problem with feeding the flesh, Moses highlighted here in Deuteronomy 32, an empty profession to the Lord. Now let's go over a few pages. We go from Deuteronomy to Joshua, and from Joshua to Judges, and from Judges to Ruth, and then to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 1. We've gone over a few pages. Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by the post of the temple of the Lord. Chapter 4, please. Chapter 4, verse 13. And when he came, lo, Eli sat upon a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came unto the city and told it, all the city cried out. Verse 18. And it came to pass when he made mention of the ark of God that he fell off from the seat backwards by the side of the gate, and his neck brake, and he died. For he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. Moses, in his song in Deuteronomy 32, he says, feeding the flesh, they got fat, and it led to an empty profession of the Lord. Here Eli, the priest in Israel, we find that he was fat, he was heavy, and it led to a lazy participation in the work. a lazy participation in the work. Eli was the high priest of Israel. He was a very important position. You could see him walking through the camp of Israel with his beautiful high priestly robes on, the white linen, embroidered linen coat and girdle. He had the mitre and the golden crown with the lace of blue. And then he had the inscription on it, holiness unto the Lord, emblazoned across the gold. There was the blue robe and the ephod. There was the bottom of the blue and scarlet with pomegranates and golden bells. There was the curious girdle. There was the breastplate with the 12 precious stones. There was the stones on the shoulders. And as he walked through the camp, no one could miss him. It was a sight to behold. They could see him from a distance. Here's Eli. Here's the high priest of Israel. He was the one who could go into the holy place before God and represent the nation. He was the only one who could go in once a year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, into the Holy of Holies, the 10th day of the 10th month, to make settlement and atonement for the sins of the nation. Very important to be the high priest. But you will know that all the furniture of the tabernacle and the temple was designed by God. He designed the altar and the laver and the coverings and the curtains and the table and the lampstands and the ark. But God never designed a chair to sit on for the tabernacle. It was not a mistake. It was not an oversight. It was to symbolically remind them that the work of ministry, the work of a priest, was never finished. It was a continual work. The only one that sat down was the Lord Jesus. When he finished the work of redemption, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. He finished the work. In Israel, they never finished the work. And so there was no seat. But we see the high priest Eli sitting on a seat in the temple. He was fat, too much weight, too much flesh. And it led to a lack of interest in the service of the sanctuary. Oh, as I prepared for this morning, I thought to myself, Laurence, could it be possible that you're an Eli? Physically, maybe overweight, but spiritually overweight, spiritually obese, and it leads to an empty profession of the Lord, and it leads to a lazy participation in the work. I had to cancel meetings, as I mentioned, between now and Christmas. It's the hardest thing I ever do, is having to cancel a meeting. I feel so guilty. I can't do anything about it, but I don't like cancelling meetings. Brother in Nairn Hall, not happy. I had to cancel a meeting, month of Sundays. Because you want to be busy in the work of the Lord. You want to be busy in doing the work. But so easy to get spiritually fat, feeding the flesh, and there's a lack of interest. Many years ago, I was brought up in the Brethren assemblies, but there was a brother in our assembly that whenever he was praying, he used to pray for those who are sick of the assembly. And we knew what he meant, but the young fella, this was hilarious, because we reckoned there was a lot more who were sick of the assembly than what he imagined. And they were just there to be seen and just there to play the part. I wonder, are you sick of the assembly? You criticize. You're against everything, a bitter spirit. No matter what the secretary announces, you'll find something to disagree with. You're out on a Sunday, no doubt. You may be out at the prayer meeting, maybe out at different meetings, but your heart's not in it. A lazy participation in the work. Happy to be an observer. Happy to use the fellowship at your convenience. Some of us are ecclesiastical hitchhikers. We say, you buy the car, you pay for the repairs, you pay for the upkeep, you pay the insurance, You fill the car with petrol, and I'll come along for the free ride. But if you have an accident, you're on your own. And I'll get a lift with somebody else. I'll go down the road. Ecclesiastical hitchhikers. You get involved. You get in the membership. You serve as deacons. You do grapple with the social issues at the members' meetings. You visit. You care. You evangelize. You give financially. And I'll just come along for the free ride. And if it doesn't suit me, I'll go elsewhere. Too much flesh. It leads to an empty profession of the Lord. Deuteronomy 32, Moses' swan song. He saw it. He could see it amongst his people, and he sang about it near his death. He highlighted it. He underlined it. And here Eli, he reminds them of an empty profession. A lazy participation in the work. People need the Lord, don't they? If ever there was a need for evangelism, it's now. There's a generation growing up that have no knowledge of the Bible stories, no knowledge of the gospel. Tragic events. Let me move on to another one. Deuteronomy 32, that was an empty profession of the Lord. 1 Samuel 1 and 9 and 1 Samuel 4, Eli, a lazy participation in the work. We're moving again, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. We're turning to Nehemiah, chapter 9. Nehemiah chapter 9. You know the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah has returned from Shushan, the palace in Persia, and he is entrusted by God to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And most of Nehemiah is how they go about building the walls and the people involved in building the walls of Jerusalem. In chapter 9, the walls are complete, and they hold a solemn fast. And they have a memorial. Nehemiah chapter 9, and we're reading verse 25 and 26. And they took strong cities and a fat land, and possessed houses full of all goods, wells digged, vineyards and olive yards and fruit trees in abundance. So they did eat and were filled and became fat and delighted themselves in thy great goodness. Nevertheless, they were disobedient and rebelled against thee, and cast thy law behind their backs, and slew thy prophets which testified against them, to burn them to thee, and they wrought great provocations. If Deuteronomy teaches us that too much of the flesh leads to an empty profession of the Lord, if Eli sitting in the tabernacle reminds us that it leads to a lazy participation in the work, then here in Nehemiah we find that it leads to a sketchy pleasure in the blessings. Israel became fat, and it led to an ingratitude and a forgetfulness, a disregard for what God had done, and the nation started to take the land of Canaan for granted, to the point where they even murdered God's servants who was warning them. They took them and they slew them. Saint of God, would this be a problem? Forgetfulness and ingratitude. The story is told of wee Johnny was going to a birthday party, and his mum, as he went out the door, says, "Now, Johnny, whenever you go to the party, you make sure you thank your friend's mum for having the party. You make sure you thank her now." "Oh, I'll thank her. So he went to the party and he came home. He had a brilliant time. There was the bouncy castle and a clown and food, and it was great. And his mum says, "Tell me, did you thank Mrs. Wilson?" "No," he says, "I didn't." "Why did you not thank her?" He says, "Well, we were going out the door, and the wee boy in front of me said, 'Thank you very much.' And she said, 'Don't mention it,' so I didn't mention it." Didn't mention him. Tell me, when last did you thank the Lord for Calvary? When last did you shed a tear because of his love and mercy and grace? When last did you worship him because of his great salvation and so show gratitude for his indwelling Spirit? Oh, I tell you, among God's people, there is a sketchy pleasure in the blessings. We take them for granted. I remember being in Mexico, it must be 20 years ago, maybe more. And we were looking around some of the sites, my wife and I, and we came across a natural phenomena found in Mexico where there's hot springs and cold springs beside each other. It's amazing. And the local women come and they wash their clothes in the hot springs, and then they can just go beside it and rinse them out in the cold spring. And one of the people on the bus said to the guide, I'm sure the ladies must be very grateful to God for providing them hot springs and cold springs right beside each other. And the guide said, no, senor, there is much grumbling because he doesn't supply soap. Isn't that like human nature? We always find something to complain about. You see the danger of being overweight. Why it can lead to an empty profession of the Lord. Moses saw that. And it can lead to a lazy participation in the work. Eli teaches us that. And here in Nehemiah, he says, why you've waxed fat and you've taken Canaan for granted, the pomegranates, the grapes, the fruit of the land. You've just taken it for granted. It leads to a sketchy pleasure in the blessings. So sad. But let's fit another one in. We're going backwards now. Nehemiah heading backwards. Ezra, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Ruth, back to Judges. Judges chapter 3. Eglon was the king of Moab. And here in Judges 3, verse 12, we read, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and possessed the city of palm trees. So the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. But when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised them up a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a man left-handed. And by him the children of Israel sent a present unto Eglon, the king of Moab. But Ehud made him a dagger which had 2 edges of a cubit length, and he did gird it under his raiment upon his right thigh. And he brought the present unto Eglon, king of Moab. And Eglon was a very fat man. And when he made an end to offer the present, he sent away the people that bear the present. But he himself turned again from the quarries that were by Gilgal, and said, I have a secret errand unto thee, O king. Who said, keep silence. And all that stood by him went out from him. And Ehud came unto him, and he was sitting in a summer parlor, and he had for himself, which he had for himself alone. And Ehud said, I have a message from God unto thee. And he arose out of his seat. And Ehud put forth his left hand, and took the dagger from under his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the haft also went in after the blade, and the fat closed upon the blade, so that he could not draw the dagger out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Some unpleasant stories in the Bible, isn't there? Here's a fat man, full of the flesh, and he wasn't prepared for an attack. He wanted to hear what the secret message was. He wanted to hear what the wee bit of news was that was for him alone. He put everybody out of the room. He was ready for a right-handed attack, but he never thought a left-handed man, never thought of an attack from that side. And he took the dagger out and he put it in. Too much of the flesh leads to an empty profession of the Lord. It leads to a lazy participation in the work. It leads to a sketchy pleasure in the blessings. And it leads to an easy prey for the enemy. Ehud put the left hand inside his coat and produced the dagger, and too much of the flesh made Eglon an easy prey. And he couldn't move quickly to avoid the blade. The target was big. The fat closed over the blade and he couldn't get it back out again. I'm sure you've seen the pictures of the African savannah. And the lions hunting their prey. And they see the wildebeest. And the lions are crouched. What are they watching for? They're watching for one that's a wee bit lame, or a wee bit slow, or not staying up with the crowd, not staying up with the herd. And they're vulnerable. And they isolate that one. And they gang up on that one away from the herd, and they're an easy prey. Satan surveys the church of Jesus Christ. Where will he make his attack? Leadership? Possibly. Those who are involved? Probably. But first, he focuses on those who have been feeding on the flesh instead of feeding on the Spirit, because they have got lazy and careless and taking things for granted, and it becomes an easy prey for the enemy. I have a problem with my weight. Constant. I need to lose weight physically, but I also need to make sure spiritually that there's not a feeding of the old nature. That there's not just an empty profession to the Lord, not just a lazy participation in the work, not just a sketchy pleasure in the blessings, and not making myself an easy prey for the enemy. The enemy's busy. The enemy delights in robbing us of the spiritual thrill and excitement of belonging to Christ. So, dear folk, this morning, as we come to an end of this wee series on fitness, looking at our diet, looking at exercise, looking at the problem of obesity, I trust you'll take it to heart, as I must do as well. Oh, that our profession to the Lord might be full. Moses said they lightly esteemed the rock of their salvation. Oh, never take salvation for granted. A lazy participation in the work, a sketchy pleasure in the blessings, and make sure you don't become an easy prey for the enemy. May God bless his word to our hearts. We're turning